multinational rail and port deal that promises to reshape trade dynamics.
The Mediterranean waters connect continents, and its currents carry centuries of trade and mystery. But in recent years, something unusual has been happening along Israel's coastline. Millions of tons of sand have been quietly removed from the seabed, an operation so vast it reshaped the shoreline itself. The reason? To build a massive new port, a project promising global trade links and national transformation. Yet beneath the promises of progress, questions linger. What happens when you alter the seabed on such a scale? What hidden consequences follow the removal of sand that has settled for thousands of years? We explore how one of the biggest dredging projects in the Mediterranean turned into a mystery that left even experts shocked. Digging into the deep along Israel's northern coast in Haifa Bay, a vast operation began that few outside the region could fully grasp. It was not a simple construction project, nor just another addition to the shoreline. This was an undertaking of staggering scale, the removal of millions of tons of sand from the seabed itself. The goal was bold, to carve out the foundations of a new deep water port capable of reshaping Israel's place in global trade. At the heart of this effort stood some of the most advanced dredging technology in the world. Dutch engineering firms renowned for mastering land reclamation against the North Sea were brought in to execute the task. Their dredgers were floating giants, machines designed to scoop, suction, and transport vast amounts of seabed material with surgical precision. Each pass cut deeper into the Mediterranean floor, pulling up sediment that had lain undisturbed for centuries. From the air, it looked almost like surgical channels widening, harbors deepening, as if the coastline itself was being rewritten by human hands. Why such ambition? The answer lay far beyond Israel's own waters. In an era defined by global supply chains, the shipping lanes of Asia have become the arteries of world commerce. China, South Korea, and other Asian powers dominate the production of goods, while Europe remains one of their largest consumers. Israel, perched at the eastern edge of the Mediterranean, sought to position itself as a vital bridge between these worlds. To achieve this, it needed a port capable of receiving the largest container ships afloat, vessels that demand depths greater than Haifa Bay had ever offered. And so the project began. The Carmel Port, a new container terminal built to rival some of the busiest hubs in the world. But before the first cranes could rise, before ships could dock, the sea itself had to be reshaped. The millions of tons of sand removed were not discarded, but relocated, repurposed to extend land outward and reclaim new space from the water. What was once seabed slowly became shoreline, the line between land and sea redrawn in real time. From the outside, it was a triumph of engineering. Headlines captured the sheer audacity. Israel removes millions of tons of sand from the Mediterranean to build its future port. But beneath the celebration, a sense of mystery lingered. What does it mean to remove so much from the ocean floor? What stories are hidden in sediment that predates modern history? Each dredger's haul was more than sand. It was layers of time, ecosystems, and fragile balances disrupted in pursuit of progress. The operation at Haifa Bay was more than a technical achievement. It was a gamble, a wager that the promise of global trade, economic growth, and strategic influence outweighed the risks of disturbing something as ancient and delicate as the seabed. The Mediterranean has always been a theater where empires rose and fell, where every stone carried a hidden story. And now, through dredgers and ambition, Israel had begun to write a new chapter on its waters, one carved directly from the deep. The promise of a new gateway. From the moment the dredgers began pulling millions of tons of sand from the Mediterranean, the purpose of such an immense operation was clear. Carmel Port was meant to be more than just another dock on Israel's northern shore. It was envisioned as a gateway, a modern terminal that would connect Israel directly into the bloodstream of global trade. The concept was simple yet ambitious. For decades, Israel's shipping capacity had lagged behind the rapid growth of international commerce. Existing ports, while functional, could no longer keep pace with the demands of mega-container ships. The colossal vessels that now carry thousands of steel boxes across oceans in a single journey. Without a new deep-water terminal, Israel risked being bypassed, forced to rely on transshipments through other Mediterranean hubs like Piraeus in Greece or Port Said in Egypt. Carmel Port was designed to change that equation. The project's backers promised more than efficiency. They framed Carmel Port as a symbol of transparency and modernization, a facility where operations would be streamlined, technology would govern logistics, and costs would be driven down. This was not just about building cranes and quays. It was about building confidence both for international shipping lines and for Israel's own economy. A transparent market, supporters argued, would transform Haifa Bay into a magnet for business, ensuring the benefits of maritime trade flowed deeper into the country's industries and households. Every detail of the new port was calculated to compete with the world's most advanced shipping hubs. Its design included automated stacking cranes, digitized tracking systems, and extended berths capable of receiving ships over 400 m long. Efficiency was marketed as a weapon. Faster turnaround times, fewer delays, and a competitive edge in a region where minutes translate directly into millions of dollars in trade value. Yet behind the engineering marvel and the economic promises lay something more elusive, the mystery of transformation itself. How could millions of tons of sand shifted from the seabed become the foundation of a gateway to Asia? For those watching from a distance, the process seemed almost alchemical. Dredgers removing the old, planners building the new, and somewhere between destruction and creation, a port emerging that could redefine a nation's trajectory. The scale of Carmel Port was unprecedented in Israel's maritime history. For the first time, the country would have a terminal that could rival those in Rotterdam or Shanghai in terms of efficiency and capacity. This ambition was not just technical but geopolitical. To stand as a bridge between Asia and Europe meant more than handling cargo. It meant claiming a place in the strategic theater where supply chains decide influence and power. Still, questions lingered. Could one port truly transform an economy? Could transparency overcome entrenched inefficiencies? And at what cost was this new gateway being carved into the Mediterranean's edge? Supporters hailed the vision of growth, while skeptics pointed to the risks: environmental disruption, shifting trade alliances, and the untested assumption that global shipping lines would divert toward Haifa. But for the engineers, planners, and politicians driving the project, one thing was certain. Carmel Port was a gamble worth taking. With millions of tons of sand already lifted from the sea, there was no turning back. What had begun as an excavation had become a symbol of a promise that Israel's future as a maritime nation would no longer be confined to shallow waters, but launched into the deep. Secrets beneath the seabed. Beneath the Mediterranean's shifting waves lies a world that few ever see. A place layered not only with sand, but with time itself. When dredgers moved millions of tons of sediment from Haifa Bay, they were not just clearing a pathway for ships. They were cutting into a natural archive, one that had remained sealed for thousands of years. Every scoop of sand lifted from the seabed carried more than grains of silica. It carried fragments of history. Ancient sediment layers revealed the quiet story of geological upheavals, storms, and sea level changes that had shaped the coastline over millennia. Marine scientists who studied these layers noted how each stratum was like a page in a book. Evidence of long-forgotten river flows, of volcanic ash drifting from eruptions far away, even of shifting climates that once altered the rhythm of the sea. But it wasn't only natural history that resurfaced. In the dredged material were hints of human presence, traces of civilizations that once thrived along the Levantine coast. Archaeologists voiced the possibility that pottery shards, stone tools, or even remnants of ancient harbors might emerge from beneath the sand. Remnants swallowed by the Mediterranean's steady advance. For a region that had witnessed the rise of Phoenicians, Greeks, and Romans, the seabed was more than a void. It was a silent museum, disturbed by the mechanical arms of modern progress. Alongside these echoes of the past, there was the living present. The seabed of Haifa Bay was home to delicate ecosystems, seagrass meadows that anchored biodiversity, spawning grounds for fish, and the intricate networks of marine invertebrates that sustained the food chain. Environmental scientists warned that dredging threatened to unravel these fragile systems. Removing sand at such scale not only destroyed habitats, but stirred up plumes of silt, clouding the water and suffocating life forms that depended on clarity and sunlight. What unsettled many was the duality of discovery. On one hand, dredging revealed glimpses of stories buried for millennia, sedimentary signatures of past worlds, perhaps even relics of forgotten people. On the other, it risked erasing present ecosystems whose value, though less dramatic, was no less profound. The scientists who spoke out were not opposed to modernization. Instead, they called for caution for methods that could balance ambition with stewardship. But in the face of schedules and economic urgency, their warnings often felt drowned out. The dredgers pressed on, their engines humming, their buckets biting deeper into the seabed, revealing layers of time while erasing layers of life. The dredgers may have finished their task, but the sea had only just begun its reply. What Israel gained in steel and concrete, it risked losing in sand, seagrass, and shoreline. And as the tides grew restless, a new question surfaced. Had the price of progress been underestimated? The shocking consequences. When the dredgers finished their work in Haifa Bay, the port stood taller, the channels deeper, and the surface calm. But beneath that polished image, the sea had changed, and not in ways anyone fully anticipated. What followed wasn't simply the construction of a new gateway. It was a cascade of ripple effects that reshaped the coastline, the water, and the lives of those who lived near it. What happened next was shocking. The first signs came quietly. Fishermen who had cast their nets in the bay for generations noticed shifts in the patterns of marine life. Species that once thrived in shallow waters began to disappear, replaced by creatures rarely seen before. For scientists, this was no mystery. By pulling millions of tons of sand from the seabed, the dredgers had disrupted breeding grounds, scattering fish populations and driving some into decline. What had seemed like a purely mechanical process, sand out, ships in, were in fact the beginning of a profound ecological shift. The water itself began to move differently with vast amounts of sand removed. New channels formed, altering the rhythm of tides in Haifa Bay. Residents along the coast started reporting unusual erosion. Beaches narrowed as waves struck harder and closer to shore. So walls, once protective barriers, now faced new pressures. For a nation whose coastlines are both cultural and economic lifelines, this was not a small inconvenience, but a warning. Environmental experts traced these patterns with growing concern. Currents once predictable became erratic, carrying silt further afield and clouding waters that had been clear. This turbidity blocked sunlight, weakening seagrass meadows that had survived for centuries. As these underwater fields thinned, the species that depended on them struggled, too. One change led to another, a domino effect where progress in shipping lanes came at the expense of ecosystems built over millennia. Yet, the shock was not only ecological. Communities tied to the sea felt the impact directly. Fishermen spoke of dwindling catches, forcing them to travel farther for smaller hauls. Beachgoers watched as familiar stretches of sand shrank year after year. Even property owners along Haifa's shoreline began to worry. Their homes suddenly vulnerable to the creeping threat of erosion. The project meant to expand prosperity had in subtle but undeniable ways redrawn the boundaries of everyday life. What unsettled observers most was the unpredictability. Advanced models had forecast gains in trade and efficiency, but few had fully accounted for how a living, breathing system would respond once millions of tons of its foundation were stripped away. Nature, as it turned out, was not passive. It pushed back, reshaping itself in ways that left engineers and policymakers scrambling to adapt. The sand removed had unlocked opportunity, but it had also unleashed change, the kind that ripples outward, touching coasts, currents, and communities. The dredging had built a port, but it had also opened a door to something older, stranger, and less predictable than concrete planners ever imagined. Whispers of what was lost. In the weeks after the dredging ended, stories began to circulate along the coast. Fishermen who rose before dawn to set their nets returned with catches unlike any they had seen before. Strange deep-sea creatures appeared in waters where they did not belong. To the seasoned eyes of these men, it was clear something beneath the seabed had been disturbed. Divers were the first to witness the changes directly. Where once the bay's floor was a smooth carpet of sand, it now revealed jagged ridges, depressions, and newly uncovered rock formations. Entire sections looked as if they had been torn open, exposing layers that had rested undisturbed for thousands of years. Some divers spoke quietly of finding shards of pottery worn by centuries under the sea, or stones arranged in patterns that looked too deliberate to be natural. None of it was documented officially, but the whispers grew louder. Marine biologists, too, were drawn into the mystery. Sediment samples pulled from the seabed revealed fragments of shells and organic matter older than anyone expected. The dredging had unearthed not just sand, but the history of the sea itself. It was a layered archive of civilizations that had lived along the Mediterranean coast, their traces now rising from the depths. Some researchers hinted that the work of progress may have erased clues to ancient settlements drowned long ago, swallowed by tides and time. The speculation only deepened when unusual objects surfaced in fishing nets. Rusted metal, unidentifiable scraps, and even large wooden beams, waterlogged but intact, puzzled both fishermen and scientists. Were these remnants of long-forgotten shipwrecks? Or had the dredging reached into places where history had been quietly buried, far from human memory? The answers remained uncertain, but each new discovery seemed to suggest that the bay had concealed more than sand. Adding to the unease were changes in the seabed soundscape. Divers reported strange echoes, as though currents bounced differently off the newly exposed terrain. Some spoke of hearing low, resonant tones, vibrations that seemed to hum from the rock itself. While oceanographers explained it as water moving through new channels, the accounts fed into a growing sense of mystery. The sea was speaking, though few could interpret what it was saying. What unsettled many was not simply the objects or creatures that appeared, but the realization that the dredging had disrupted a balance far older than the port project. The Mediterranean has always been a cradle of history, a meeting point of civilizations, and the sand that was removed may have been part of that story. If so, then progress had not only altered currents and ecosystems, but also brushed away the quiet traces of the past. For locals who lived with the sea every day, the feeling was inescapable. The Carmel Port might symbolize modern ambition, but beneath its foundations lay mysteries never meant to be disturbed. And now, with whispers spreading from docks to laboratories, the question lingered. What else had been lost when millions of tons of sand were taken from the deep, hidden in plain sight? While rumors spread along the docks and fishermen swapped tales of strange catches, another narrative was unfolding quietly in official records. Buried in market reports, environmental studies, and government statements was a more calculated picture of what the dredging had truly achieved. On the surface, the benefits were undeniable. The new Carmel Port was presented as a triumph of modern infrastructure, a gateway that would link Israel more directly to Asia, cutting shipping times and costs. Trade analysts described it as a bold step toward transforming Haifa Bay into a hub that could rival the busiest ports of the Mediterranean. Jobs were created in construction, engineering, and logistics, feeding into an optimistic narrative of progress. In glossy brochures and official presentations, the dredging was framed as the removal of obstacles, the clearing of a path for opportunity. But alongside these claims, environmental studies painted a more complicated reality. Surveys of the seabed documented measurable declines in marine habitats. Seagrass meadows, once thriving nurseries for fish, showed signs of damage. Populations of shellfish and crustaceans were disrupted, their numbers shifting in ways scientists struggled to predict. The dredging had not only rearranged sand, it had redrawn the living map of the bay. Some reports highlighted another troubling detail. Increased coastal erosion. Shorelines that had been stable for decades began to retreat, waves striking with greater force as currents shifted. For local residents, this was not just an academic concern. Small beaches grew narrower and so walls bore the brunt of the changes. What was once sold as a clean exchange sand for trade now seemed to carry hidden costs. Even market reports, often glowing in their forecasts, contained shadows of doubt. Analysts noted that while the port promised to boost competitiveness, it also tied the economy more tightly to volatile global shipping markets. In an age where supply chains could be disrupted overnight, some questioned whether such heavy investment in physical expansion was truly future-proof. The most revealing aspect was what the reports did not say. Nowhere in the polished summaries did they mention the pottery shards divers claimed to have seen or the unusual fish in local nets. The language of progress had no room for whispers of the past or for mystery science could not yet explain. And yet, for anyone willing to read between the lines, the silence itself was striking. What emerged from this paper trail was not a single answer, but a dual reality. On one side, the Carmel Port showed economic ambition, a project that promised to pull Israel deeper into global trade routes. On the other, the long-term environmental and cultural costs remained unresolved. Tucked into the footnotes of studies few outside academic circles would ever read. Hidden in plain sight, the dredging of Haifa Bay was more than an engineering feat. It was a story told in fragments of official success and unofficial concern, visible gains and invisible losses. And in the gap between the two, the mystery of what truly happened beneath the waves remained as unsettled as ever. A legacy written in sand. In an age when container ships stretched longer than skyscrapers are tall, the Port of Ireland could not keep pace. Its berths were too short, its waters too shallow, and its road and rail connections too thin to carry cargo efficiently to Israel's heartland. Every container offloaded in it faced a long, expensive journey north by truck. For a country that thrived on speed and innovation, this was a bottleneck. Worse still, sits within one of Israel's most fragile ecosystems. The coral reefs along its shore are among the most biodiverse in the region, and any attempt at aggressive dredging there would risk destroying them. Environmental restrictions and geographic constraints left little room for expansion. The government understood the dilemma. Trade with Asia was the future, yet Israel's eastern gate could not open wide enough to receive it. The solution lay not in it, but in the north. Haifa with its broad bay and access to the Mediterranean steep channels offered what a lot could not room to grow. But Haifa had a different problem. Decades of siltation and shallow seabeds meant its harbour could not immediately accommodate the new generation of supertankers and container ships either. To make Haifa the country's true maritime hub, the sea itself had to be reshaped. That meant dredging on a scale Israel had never attempted. Millions of tons of sand were carved from the bay, scooped up and displaced to create deeper channels, wider turning basins, and artificial extensions of land where new terminals could rise. This duality of ambition and consequence, progress and mystery is the true legacy written in sand. Decades from now, when ships continue to dock and new generations walk the altered shores, the dredging of Haifa Bay will be remembered not only as an engineering achievement, but as a turning point. It will symbolize both the power and the limits of human ambition.